My name is Jason.
My name is Tom.
And this is Fear of a Black Dragon, an old school RPG podcast.
And in this episode, we're doing some spectral analysis as we look at the Ghost of Mistmoor.
Our first segment is the basic crawl.
The Ghost of Mistmoor is an 18-page adventure from Dungeon Magazine number 35, published in 1992. It was written by Leonard Wilson, with artwork by Tom Dow. The cover painting of Dungeon 35 features a scene from The Ghost of Mistmoor and was created by Scott Burdick. Onto the contents. The adventure begins with introductory material for both players and the DM. The premise of the adventure is this. A young nobleman, Blaine, owes a lot of back taxes to the local duke, who is calling in that debt as a way of punishing Blaine for wooing his daughter without his permission. Blaine is the owner of the dilapidated, abandoned Mistmoor Manor. There are rumours of a secret treasure vault somewhere on the property, and he needs the party's help getting it. On travelling to Mistmoor Manor, he'll tell you some basic details of the house's history, namely that 2 centuries ago, Lord Mistmoor's family and servants were slain by his insane daughter, who then killed herself. The manor is now said to be haunted by the ghost of the murderous girl. Blaine has already made one attempt at finding the treasure vault, but it was cut short when he encountered the ghost and ran away. And listeners, from here on out, we have heavy spoilers for this adventure. You have been warned.
So after the introductory material, we learn about Psyche, a young thief pretending to be the Ghost of Mistmoor. She and her boyfriend are currently squatting at Mistmoor Manor, and will try to scare off anyone who turns up there. She has seen a painting of the murderous Mistmoor girl from 200 years ago, and has disguised herself to look like her. She also has magic items and skills that allow her to move like a ghost. Next, we learn a little bit more about the true story of Mistmoor Manor, which is that an evil priest, Erebus, disguised as a pet raven, drove the Mistmoor girl, Regine, to madness. We also learn that Regine was one of 3 identical triplets, the other sisters being Rebecca and Reverie. As it turns out, the ghosts of Regine, Rebecca, and Reverie are haunting Mistmoor Manor. They each have their own personalities and quirks, but because they are identical, the party will likely believe them to be the same person. The whole thing is complicated by Psyche pretending to be a ghost for a grand total of 4 identical entities haunting Mistmoor Manor, identical in appearance at least. From there we have 43 keyed locations for the 3 floors of the Mistmoor Manor dungeon, the ground floor, the upper floor, and the basement. Some highlights include the famous privy trap, in which a portable hole magic item has been set in the privy, be careful where you sit. A gallery of family portraits, which functions as a sort of puzzle that reveals the truth of the Mistmoor sisters. A stuffed black dragon in the basement, which the spirit of the priest Erebus can reanimate. And an underground river and accompanying claustrophobic cave crawl. A key feature of this adventure is a series of hauntings that take place over the course of the night that the characters are in Mistmoor Manor. These hauntings are divided up into 3 time periods: evening, the middle of the night, and early in the morning. Each time period has a set of ghostly encounters which, taken all together, reveal important information about the history of Mistmoor Manor and the adventure itself, as well as giving you plenty of face time with the ghostly Mistmoor sisters. Finally, we have information on the treasure vault, how to access it, how to escape it, what can be found there, and the final confrontation with Erebus, who has been trapped inside. There is also a section on how to conclude the adventure. So Tom, let's talk about our bona fides here.
Yeah.
What's your experience with the Ghost of Mistmoor?
Well, sadly, I've only read it, and as a spoiler for my upcoming review in a few seconds, this is another one of those ones where I regret that we've now done an episode on this, so I can't justify running it myself now. It seems really good.
Yes.
How about you?
I ran it very recently over the course of 3 sessions using Trophy Gold. It was part of a special Halloween weekend series game that I did. So let's talk about things we liked. Oh boy, I'm going to just kick off by saying that this is not hyperbole at all, and I'm not saying this just because I just finished it either. This is in my top 5 of adventure modules of all time. I love the Ghost of Mistmoor. It is so good. The main reason why I love it so much is because of the structure. This adventure promises a certain type of thing, which is a ghost story, a mystery, a puzzle to sort of solve, and a pretty cool dungeon crawl, actually. It makes this big, big promise in 20 pages or whatever it is. And the structure of it, like, it nails it. It just absolutely nails it. It was a great, great experience. That's my high level praise for the adventure. I mean, I can just dive into things, or if you want to kind of say some things that you enjoyed about them from the read.
Yeah, a quick follow-up, I mean, is that I'm always a little bit skeptical of Dungeon Magazine adventures because they tended to be a bit random, sometimes a bit thrown together. But this one, I started reading and was just entranced by this, especially because almost as soon as I started reading, I realised that if you think back to The Sinister Secret of Saltmarsh and how we enjoyed the revealed layers of that, which sort of has a promise that you're going to get a haunted mansion, but it's not really haunted, but then there are some monsters in it. But this adventure, for me, takes that promise and delivers better on it, because you've got these layers of ghosts, and it does it in a solidly gothic ghost story-ish way, which is... So tonally, all the different reveals work better together, I think, compared to Saltmarsh, which was a bit sort of, oh, no, the adventure's actually over here doing something else. It's smugglers, that kind of thing. Yeah, I don't know. This definitely is someone who's taken... There's no way the author had not read Saltmarsh, right? So he's taken this idea, I think, and figured out how to make it work better. And I think that's just, it's fantastic.
I agree completely. And in play, that's how it comes across. What I think is so fascinating about the Ghost of Mistmoor, just at a high level still here, is that the author understands the distinction between a dungeon crawl and a ghost story, and understanding that distinction and kind of how those things are different and what sorts of things you expect to happen in that kind of adventure manages to merge them in a way that is super, super cool. Because as you're doing the dungeon crawl portion, you have opportunities to learn about the ghost story and to learn about the lore of Mistmoor Manor. And there are really good reasons for you to backtrack and discover more as the adventure goes on. In truth, you're spending a night in Mistmoor Manor. That's what you're doing. But you're also doing a dungeon crawl. And both of those things just come through so well that it just makes this module stand out. If you had to think of the sort of ideal sort of dungeon that is a haunted house, I mean, this feels like it in a lot of ways. So getting into specifics, for me, it's the structure. The key to this scenario is the history of the Mistmoor family and figuring out the truth of, first of all, the truth of the quote ghost, which is that there's multiple ghosts and one of them is fake, but also the sort of history of the sisters themselves and how they're different from each other. And the adventure is structured so that you can discover all that stuff in a lot of different ways, and all of them are engaging. As I noted before, you can learn things just via simple exploration, finding clues and puzzles in the environment. You can just sort of survive the night and learn things via the structured, timed haunting encounters that we talked about in the opening crawl. You can also learn a lot just through social interactions. Psyche and her boyfriend, Brock, who are there squatting at the manor, pretending to be a ghost, they know some things, they don't know other things, and you can learn some key things from them, but not everything from them. And also the sisters themselves. You can have interactions with the ghostly sisters. And so there's all these different ways of learning the lore of the place. And importantly, that lore is really important to the final encounter. The final sort of face-off with the villain. You are much better equipped for it if you know the story. And so it's really great that way.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked in previous episodes as well about the value of talkative NPCs, which is, NPCs who don't, they might hide some things, but they tell you that they unburden themselves of the plot at you when you ask. This module also has what you could call talkative props. You find a journal,
right, yeah,
or something, and you read it. You start to get the lore, and I think it's brilliant because I've seen GMs make the mistake of thinking, oh, this mystery is too easy, I'm going to make it more difficult to find out what's going on, and that is a mistake, right?
It's a total mistake.
It's a total mistake. Mm-hmm. So here it's a case of there are plenty of things you can get wrong during the adventure, and that can come back to, oh, I was about to say haunt you, I've committed to it to haunt you at the end, so you can still mess up and have a problem later, but you can never I think it's difficult to not find out what's going on, right?
Yeah, well, because there's so many ways to sort of stumble into it. And I was running it in Trophy Gold, and there's a mechanical, automatic way of finding out things.
I have questions about that later, but yes.
Yeah. We'll pin that for later. Kind of getting back to the structure, the timed haunting events, the 3 time periods of your night in Mistmoor Manor, which is the evening, the middle of the night, and then the early morning. Each of those has 3 or 4 hauntings, like little encounters with the ghosts, basically. Mostly. There's some other little things too, but it's mostly interacting with the sisters. This is such an incredible addition to the overall dungeon. There's a version of this dungeon where all the author did is just do the dungeon with the keyed locations and maybe include some notes about the 3 different ghosts. And that probably would have worked fine. You could have improv'd that pretty easily. But having it structured in this way, where there are essentially timed events that are happening throughout the night, accomplishes a lot of really cool things. For one thing, it forces the players to interact with certain parts of the keyed, certain keyed locations in the dungeon, certain places, certain objects that can be found there, certain encounters. They all make more sense depending on which of the hauntings you've seen and how you've interacted with them. And so the way that they sort of connect up with each other is really, really cool. It guarantees that you're going to get automatic ghostly shenanigans on a regular basis, which is what you've signed up for in an adventure like this. You can learn everything you need to know about the sisters via these timed encounters. And we should talk a little bit about the sisters, because this is really important to understanding what makes the dungeon so cool. The 3 ghostly sisters, there's the murderous one, Regine, which we know a little bit about. This evil priest in the form of a raven drove her mad. But there are 2 other sisters as well. There's Rebecca, who is lovelorn. She has this young man, Tom, who she's in love with, and she thinks that one of the player characters is Tom. And then we have Reverie, who is this quiet, shy, poetic sister. What's so fascinating is they all behave really differently, and they all interact with the player characters really, really differently. But because they look identical to each other, there's a chance that the players think they're just dealing with an erratic ghost, which makes sense because ghosts don't have to be logical. They can be emotional and erratic. That's the whole thing about ghosts. But in this case, it's 3 different ghosts. And then you add in the 4th wildcard element of the thief pretending to be a ghost, and it just creates this really, really cool dynamic where the players are searching the dungeon, but also trying to figure out what's going on. And so they want to engage with the history of the place, and it's really, really cool. Also, I've already kind of noted this, but these timed haunting events, they start to encourage players to backtrack through the house, which is great, because they start to realize that if I go back to certain places, I'll run into this ghost here, or I'll have a chance of running into this ghost again. It goes from a dungeon crawl to being more about just being in this place and interacting with this place in cool ways. And so I really love the timed haunting events. Thought that was so great. I'll stop for a minute though, because I have loads of things to say about the structure.
Okay. Oh, yeah, I definitely want to talk about the ghosts, the 3 sisters, the real ghosts, that is. I think they're wonderful. I think what's very important and great here is that their story is properly sad. Even the one who did the murders. And that's really important, which I think we're going to discuss more later. And I like how very different they are from each other. The way they're different from each other is pretty one-dimensional, to be honest. There's the mad one, the bookish one, the sexy one. But you kind of need that. That's part of not making the mystery too obscure. So that's really important. Yeah, I just think those characters are very well drawn, and they're very well realised in, again, the things you find around the house that are related to them. It's not just this ghost acts like this when you see her, but also you find evidence of what they're like. And of course, that's going to be, I assume, you can let me know if I'm right about this, that's part of how the PCs start to figure out there are 3 of them.
Right, they do.
Yeah, this journal clearly doesn't belong to the person we just saw, therefore
right, yeah.
Something else is going on. Yeah.
And a lot of it depends on where they start too, which is another cool thing about the structure of the dungeon, because there's lots of ways of entering Mistmoor Manor, and depending on how you start, you're getting different parts of it, but it all holds together. You might go in through the yard and the stables and start searching the crypt first, which has different types of information than the inside of the house. You can go straight to the 2nd floor and find that portrait gallery, which has some clues to reveal, or the bedrooms. The bedrooms say a lot about the residents of Mistmoor Manor, or the former residents. And so that's another interesting part of the structure, is the way that, depending on how you approach it, you're getting a slightly different order of things. But that variable order is strung together by those timed events. Those timed haunting events make it all come together in a really cool way. Something I want to say that I loved about this is it's actually quite light on combat, very light on combat. There are only a handful of combat encounters, and there are no random encounter tables at all. And what I think is so great about that is it really forces you to focus on doing the story that you're meant to be doing. This is meant to be a ghost story. We're going to talk about ghost stories in the Expert Delve. This is meant to be a ghost story, and it has the trappings of the dungeon crawl, but the focus really is on this story and on the history of this place. And so I really appreciated that it was light on combat. It felt like a bold thing to do. Because again, there's another version of this where it's littered with zombies and shit, right?
Yeah, I think it's still about D&D things. You know, the plot is about an evil cleric who's infiltrated a place, which is also one of the plot lines of Keep on the Borderlands. But author has a refreshingly cavalier attitude to actually doing D&D. Like, he's sort of going, you know, these ghosts are like this. They're not like the ones in the monster manual, and I'm not going to give them a new name. I'm not going to call them, you know, spectralites or something, just so you can categorize them as a separate being. Although he does then invent a thing called the Ether Shadow, but whatever, you know. Generally, he's just clearly going, well, yeah, we're doing this, and I'm doing it in a D&D magazine. And to be fair, I think if the only game you know how to play or run is D&D second ed by this point, right? I think it's pretty easy. Yeah. But he hasn't really pandered to... Sometimes you see these things where an adventurer is clearly pandering to the need for some combat scenes and some magic items. But this doesn't really do that very much, which I think is really good.
Yeah, it knows what it wants to be. It knows what it wants to do, and I think that's what's great about it. Another thing I love, the dungeon does a great job of foreshadowing things. And if players are paying close attention, they will pick up on these things. But if they're not paying close attention, or they just blow things off, then they're not going to pick up on key things. And I really like that part of it. It rewards like the players getting really invested in the details. So for example, in the beginning, Blaine tells you a story of how his horses were scared off, right? And then later on, the group's horses are scared off. And that's a really interesting detail because it doesn't mean much in the grand scheme of things, but it's a sort of clue that like there's something else going on, that it alludes to the idea that maybe there's not really a ghost, that maybe there's somebody else doing this. And in fact, if you investigate your horses being run off, you'll notice that there was some sabotage indicating that it wasn't a ghost that did it. There are some animated skeletons that you encounter because Erebus, the evil cleric, is still there doing it. There are some animated skeletons, and that's a great foreshadowing of the eventual animated Black Dragon.
Right. Yeah.
There's loads of details like this, like where certain little things foreshadow other things, and it all just kind of comes together in a really great,
it's
way.
The essence of horror structure, isn't it? But those skeletons are great. That's one of my notes. Is they're skeletons that they're not just skeletons that animate and try and stab you with spears. They specifically try and mob you and then drown you, and that is properly scary. Yeah. And especially, I think, good in trophy, presumably, because that's a thing where you get to have the skeleton scare early on. If you find them early on, you won't die from it. But even so, you know ruin, right? Damage, effectively, that you've taken now could be the death of you later on because of that failure. So it's kind of win-win. You get to escape from the horror but still experience it. And it's a terrible image. Imagine how awful that water is going to be after all this time as well.
Right, yeah. I want to call out one really, really brilliant moment in the adventure that I think ties together a lot of what I've been saying today. There's this moment, it's one of the hauntings, where the ghost of Regine is trying to wash the blood from her garment in the fountain in the courtyard. This moment is so good because there are a few things that give players clues about what might be going on here or deceive them about what might be going on here. So depending on how or when the party sort of search things, they may already know that the fountain has no water. And if they know that, it changes how they perceive the character trying to wash the blood from their garment. Or they could have already learned about Psyche and that the blood staining her garment is actually this like berry juice concoction. And this is what happened in my game. The players in my game thought that was Psyche trying to wash the berry juice from her garment instead of Regine washing the blood. And when they approached her, the raven landed on her shoulder, indicating that it was actually Regine, and we had like kind of a whoa moment.
Yes.
But I love it. It's such a cool moment because, again, depending on how you interacted with things, depending on how you approach things, you're going to receive this moment differently.
Right.
And I just think it speaks to the sort of terrific structure of the adventure.
It's that emergent horror thing, isn't it? That's not scary if you, the GM, announce, oh, by the way, it's the murderous ghost, if she tells you her name. But if you put two and two together, then it's scary.
Yeah. Anything else you want to call out about what you liked from a read? Or
I want to mention the two thieves, Brock and Psyche. I like these guys. They're the rival adventuring party, basically, but they're experienced adventurers, and they come across to me a bit. They sort of remind me of the sort of people you sometimes meet when you're a teenager, like sort of vaguely hippie types who've sort of been around a bit and seen things,
Right.
And they because the things they do, like you said, they know things about the mansion, but also they have these tricks, like they've got magic items that they actually use in how to explain this? I'm not like a big fan of that whole sort of quote unquote realistic use of magic items where they're sort of commodities and you're sort of people are thinking, what's the optimum amount of stuff to put into a portable hole? But Brock does have a portable hole, and he makes a pretty clever trap with it where he's put a cloth over the privy hole, and if you fall through it, normally you would just fall into a pit, but what they do is you fall into a portable hole, he grabs it, he takes you somewhere else and dumps you out of it. And
to the prison and dumps you there.
Yeah. Right. That, to me, it feels like someone who's sort of had this stuff for a while, has tried out has learned a few tricks with it. There's a mention as well, he's lurking usually. By the way, he can't speak. I don't think we've mentioned that yet. He took a throat injury at some point, and so he's a mute fighter.
I messed it up when I ran it.
Did you? Oh, really?
I had him talk, and then I realized halfway through, and then I backtracked a little bit.
But he has like a cloak of elvenkind. Is that the one that disguises you? And it mentions that if someone comes poking around under the house where he's hiding, he just stays still and trusts in his cloak to keep him hidden.
Yeah.
And that one line just to me sort of said a lot about this guy's character. He's a cool customer, doesn't overreact, he knows his gear because he's been in this game a long time. It's just they seem pretty cool. All the NPCs, I say all, there's not that many, are there? There's 4, 6, 7, 8, including the bad guy.
Well, they're all quite likable. Yeah. Psyche,
good.
Brock, Blaine, the young nobleman, is very likable in his way. Even Erebus, you get the classic cackling villain out of him, which can be fun.
Yeah.
And the sisters are all very fun to play too, the Ghost sisters. Oh, a funny thing about that portable hole, going back to the idea of how beautifully this dungeon is structured. If you go to the dungeon first, there is a previous victim of the portable hole trap in the dungeon. So if you go there first, you can learn a little, you get some hints that there's something else going on because they tell you what they experienced. That might be your entree to Psyche and Brock, or it could be you falling through the privy hole, or it could be you just piecing together that there are two squatters here pretending to be a ghost. It's really cool the way it all kind of comes together. I do want to make a little note about the actual dungeon crawl portion. I do think they're actually pretty good. I wouldn't say it's the focus of the adventure at all, but there are some pretty cool moments and set pieces that stood out to me. The crypt is a good one. The underground stream that is used to keep things cold in the cold storage, that's a really cool thing because it's a very tight passage and you could crawl through it to get through the underground portion if you wish. And I'm not really sure how that plays out in D&D. I don't recall, but in Trophy, it's great because it's a really dangerous risk roll to do it that way. And you actually find someone who tried to escape that way down in that portion, which is fun. There's the Black Dragon. This sadly did not come up in my game. The characters did not make it there, but I love the idea of you walk into that chamber and you just see a black dragon, it's just there. And again, this black dragon is foreshadowed in the beginning, but it's almost like a throwaway thing. And then suddenly here it is, it reappears again at the end, There's some really, really good big set piece moments. Also the bedrooms, the different style of bedrooms and the way they tell the story. Another really fun part of the dungeon crawl portion.
Nice.
Why don't we move on to questions that we had? I see that we have a few here. Go ahead and kick us off.
There's some discussion within the text of, I think the default is it's going to be one night in the mansion, but it talks about how you could have the characters stay over and spend more than one. Did you do all in one night across your 3 sessions?
Yeah, it was just one night, and I actually set it up that way. I did kind of an out-of-character thing. This is all going to take place in one night, and there are 3 time periods, and that works in Trophy Gold because I connected up some set goals to the time periods.
Did you use all of the encounters as written? Because it seems like a long list, but I don't know which ones I'd cut. I don't think any of them really. But
do you mean like the encounters leading up to the dungeon? Or...
no, I mean just that whole timed section. Like when you read it, it seems like an awful lot of things, but maybe it's not.
I used every single one of them, because you're not supposed to move on to the next one until you do them all.
Yeah, exactly. So I wondered about that, yeah.
So we did all of them in the first 2 time periods, and then we did the very first one in the 3rd time period, but we didn't finish it because they had already found the vault by that point.
Ah, okay.
And we got to the conclusion.
Okay, interesting. Yeah. Also related, you mentioned set goals, and that for me, I think, is a very stealable bit of trophy tech for other games. Yeah. I'd say that the hunt roll is maybe the main one, and then another one is set goals. So could you talk a bit about how you use them here to lend direction to the proceedings? And especially worth mentioning, I think, is the set goals in trophy, and in games in general, can be something the PCs don't know in character, but the players do. So like how we go to the village of Homlet, our characters think they're going to buy some horse supplies, but we know we're going to have an adventure.
Right.
Something like that. But yeah, could you talk a bit about how you use them in this case?
Yeah. Like you said, the set goals and trophy goal, they're usually out of character story goals, essentially. Typically, they are things like set goal, which access the next part of the dungeon, right? That's usually what they are. But they can also be like learn a key part of the story type goals. And so they're kind of perfect for a dungeon like this. So what I did is I had a set goal I had 2 set goals on the ground floor, one for the yard area and one for the actual house. And then I had 1 set goal for the dungeon portion, or the basement portion rather, and then 1 set goal for the upper level. And with the exception of the courtyard one, which was just a set goal about finding Psyche and Brock's treasure stash, the other set goals that were based on the levels, they were all about finding and accessing the vault, because they know they're there to find the vault. One of them was like, find the location of the vault. The other was like, how do you get in the vault? And the third is, how do you escape the vault? Because that's important. It's a magical transdimensional space. As the players are sort of like searching and doing this, they can learn all these things naturally. They don't have to spend tokens, but you can spend this token currency in order to automatically achieve the goal. But then I did something kind of special for this one, connected up to the timed hauntings. I made set goals for each of the 3 time periods. And each of those was about basically automatically learning a part of the story that you would need to face Erebus at the end. Again, they could discover that naturally in exploration, and they did discover some of it naturally, but sometimes they spent the tokens to just learn it automatically. So in Trophy Gold, the set goals make it to where you really, it's almost like a fail-safe.
Yeah.
The players have a chance to automatically learn the things they need to know about the story, but they do so at the risk of spending tokens that they might need later on. So in our game, the characters entered the vault without knowing how to escape it. And if they had 3 hunt roll tokens when they entered the vault, they could have just automatically learned the answer. But they didn't, because they spent them on other things. And so they're suddenly in the vault, an incredibly dangerous encounter, trapped, and they had to fight it out. They had no choice. It was very, very dangerous. And so that's the sort of risk reward of Trophy Gold. Like, yes, you can spend your tokens to learn these things and do these things, but you might need them later.
Even if you are not using a token economy like that, I think sometimes telling people the set goal is enough, right? So you, out of character, you know that upstairs there's a secret to be found of whatever kind, and you might even name that secret, and then they're aware that it's a thing they should be doing.
Well, it kind of really goes to this like philosophy of play, right? Which is that it's okay to have out of character information sometimes.
Sure. Yeah, exactly.
Fabulous. Okay, so I have one question. What did you think about all the Greek myth references? Because most of the characters have like Greek myth names. The passwords for the vault are like Medusa and Pegasus and stuff like that.
Yeah, that's the thing, is that they're just names, they're not really references, which I think is in a way more annoying. Like,
I thought so too. It's the only weak part of it to me.
No, that's because they don't mean anything. Although I'm also glad there wasn't some kind of weird trying to map characters to specific relationships between like nymphs and deities. I also have reservations about the name Reverie by just taking the E off the end of an existing word. But it's okay. It's okay. It's fine. It's D&D. It's all right. Yeah.
Fair enough. Let's go to the chain lightning round. Go ahead, Tom.
Okay. The author's note on one last thing to remember about the hauntings. Quote, The 3 real ghosts are identical triplets, and Psyche has patterned her disguise after one of their portraits, so the party will find them visually indistinguishable from each other. The PC's initial impression should be that they're seeing only one ghost, one who behaves very erratically.
As a follow-up on that one, I love that in the portrait gallery you have this really fantastic puzzle/clue that will help players figure out what's going on with these erratic behaving ghosts, or in this case, they think it's a ghost at that point, just one. This clue is so great because I'm not going to say what it is, but essentially what it does is it's a big, big, big clue towards the idea that they are in fact 3 identical triplets. But it's presented in this really, really cool way to where you actually have to kind of use your smarts to figure it out. And I love it.
A nice bit of atmosphere setting lower down in the basement level, I think. In the stream just south of the trapdoor is Regine's limed-over skeleton, still clutching the hilt of the rusted dagger impaled in her breast.
At a certain point, Psyche, as the ghost, drops her, quote, bloody knife, but the knife is actually just covered in this thick berry juice concoction. It's a really fabulous clue, but one that the players only find if they go to where Psyche as the ghost was and see that she dropped the knife.
Very nice. There is at one point a kind of side-on schematic diagram of how the portable hole trap works, and I like it because it reminds me of a kid's magic book from the 60s or 70s that shows you how illusions are done.
At a certain point, the ghost Rebecca may want to go make out with the player character she believes is her lover, Tom. She will want to go do this in the stable loft, which is a really, really devious move by the author because there's a chance that the characters have not yet cleared out the giant spiders in the stable loft. So, yeah, love that. Let's go to the expert delve. It's the Expert Delve. Today we're talking about ghost stories, in particular how they differ from other types of horror stories, and how you can make elements of a good ghost story come alive at the table. And I'm going to talk a little bit as well about presenting the ghost and making the ghost an interesting encounter at the table. Right. This is going to be a little similar to sort of our haunted house discussion a bit. Well, no, because our haunted house discussion was more about dungeons with big set pieces, right? I think that was kind of the main thing there. Here we're talking about the ghost story, which is different from the horror story. And I like how this one author put it, which is ghost stories are implicit while horror stories are explicit. And I think that lines up pretty well with my thinking on the distinction between the two. What do you think about that as a distinction?
Not totally sure I agree with the second half of it, but yes, the implicit part is important because there are so many kinds of ghost stories that are still very affecting, emotionally. If you think through the backstory, they range from something like this, or you can have light rom-coms involving a ghost. You can have absolute heart-rending tragedy stories, quite light things like something like Coco.
Yeah.
All of these feature sadness and loss and emotions kind of out of control, which I think is going to be a bit of a theme of what we're talking about, or overriding emotions, I suppose. And that's what you need to have somewhere in it, in the backstory or in the foreground, depending on what you're doing,
Well, in fact, Mistmoor is fairly light.
Yeah.
It's not like a particularly scary dungeon. I mean, there's some creepiness to it, and that's certainly aided by how you present things, I guess. But it's a fairly light thing because you can make friends with the ghosts, right? And there's almost like a comedy of mistaken identity going on with Rebecca specifically. And yet, like you mentioned in the first segment, there's a tragedy here. There's a sadness to these ghosts. As you learn more about the story, you learn that there's a real tragedy here that's sort of causing all this to happen.
Yeah.
I think the idea of the ghost stories being implicit is this idea that while a ghost story might be creepy on the surface, the real fear factor, as it were, comes from that tragic event, right? It comes from the trauma that the person suffered in life that caused them to come back as a ghost. It's the murder, it's the suicide, this, incredibly traumatic event. I remember in college, I did a paper on the turn of the screw. It has some creepy bits to it, but it's kind of a dry story, if I'm being honest. It's a pretty dry tale. But because I was doing a paper on it, I had to think pretty deeply about what was really going on in the story, the symbolism and the implied history of the manor. And the more I thought about it, the more I began to explore the implications of what was actually happening in that house that's in the focus of the turn of the screw and the people that live there. And that was the creepy part. That was the scary part.
Right. Yeah, you think about it later, don't you? It's sort of when Mistmoor is finished and you've you've stopped fighting giant spiders in the loft, 2 days later, you'll still be thinking about Regine killing herself.
Yeah.
Because she's killed her family and lost her one friend, that pet raven. That's gone as well. And committing suicide. I almost can't believe this got published in a 1990s Dungeon magazine if you think through what's actually in the backstory, but somehow they got away with it.
It did indeed. So I think that, like, as a sort of big thematic sort of approach here, I think this is what you want to aim for if you are either preparing to run a ghost story type adventure or if you're writing one, right? I think is this idea of what's important is the lore. What's important is the story. What's important is what caused these people to be ghosts. What is the trauma? Much like this module does, you want to build it and prepare it so that the players can discover those things. It's the implied horror of it. It's the implication, which I think is really powerful. I know you have some thoughts here about passions and fetters. Tell us of this.
So my first thought was, what's the way to create these ghost stories in a way that becomes then manageable for you, the GM or whatever, to keep hold of at the table. And my suggestion here is that you can steal from the old World of Darkness game, Wraith the Oblivion. Now, Wraith had a lot of things going on in it, including the classic sort of slightly too many different character types and an elaborate backstory. Yeah. Don't worry about all that stuff. But it also had the whole thing of your darkest self being played by the player to your left, essentially, which is another interesting bit of game design, but not one we want here necessarily. But I think what you can take, regardless of whether you're doing a kind of haunted house like Mistmoor, or you can have ghosts that are still effective in other stories as well. You can have a dungeon crawl in a barrow and find a ghost in that, that kind of thing. So the passions and fetters, I think, yes, these are the two key things from Wraith that are worth stealing. So passions were a thing that, or are, still playable today, a thing that defines your character in terms of what keeps them being a ghost, basically. The thing that stops them from being able to move on to the proper afterlife. So in other words, this idea, the sentiment of like, I can't let go of these feelings because they're all I have. So if you think of something like, it's what fuels them, but it's also what keeps them trapped. So if you think of something light-hearted-ish like Ghost, where Patrick Swayze's sticking around because that's a little unclear. Does he want revenge? Does he want to protect...
He's trying to protect Demi Moore, right?
Both, I think, yeah. Oh, yeah, didn't make it into my companion adventures, by the way, but I think the scenes where he meets other ghosts are, like, really interesting for this reason, I think, because you try and imagine why are they still here? And the Crow is the other one. Now, he's got a body, not technically a ghost, but he's
more
fueled by... as a revenant in Wraith the Oblivion speak, an entire source book that doesn't mention the Crow once, somehow. But it's this idea that, of course, it's not destructive. That's the problem. It's keeping them in stasis. Now, in Mistmoor, actually, it's something to do with error, but it's the evil cleric that's keeping them trapped and they would move on.
Right.
But I think even if your backstory has that little bit in it, you can still have these very focused emotions. Real-life ghost stories often feature that. It's the idea that there's so much sorrow in, say, this widow that she haunts the place where her husband died because she has to keep coming back to there. She cannot ever leave it until she's laid to rest somehow. That's passions. Let's put a pin in fetters for now. What do you think about passions and how to note-take on them, or what's the best way to use them for prepping your ghosts, do you think?
A lot of this is going to depend on like how important are the ghosts to the story. Mm-hmm. There's obviously the sort of version of the dungeon that you do where the ghosts are just monsters that you encounter and you may not really care about a lot of these details. I think that's not what we're talking about today.
No.
I think what we're talking about here is where, like Mistmoor, the ghost is really the focus. And I think that you just need to make sure in your prep, if you're prepping a pre-written thing that has a ghost story at the heart of it, I think you need to know that story. You need to know the passions. You need to know like what drives them. You need to know what caused them to be in this way. And you need to be able to speak to it and react appropriately when those things come up. Now, Ghost of Mistmoor, what's really nice about Ghost of Mistmoor, it goes back again to the structure being so clever, is you don't have to remember that much because the timed hauntings, you just go and do the next little thing and it does the thing it's supposed to do. You don't have to remember paragraphs of information, right? You can just kind of like follow along as the players are doing. But even that said, though, I think it's important to sort of understand what those passions are and be able to speak to them at the table. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think it does. I think you're right that that level of prep for the timed events is actually quite difficult to do. So that's why you have published adventures. But it's occurred to me, that while we're talking about this now, I mentioned or I described the ghosts earlier as one-dimensional, But of course, that's a feature of ghosts, isn't it? They're not.
They
if
do
they were
one thing,
balanced,
yeah.
if they were balanced people, they wouldn't be ghosts. They would have gone to their eternal
That's
rest
right.
or what have you.
Yeah.
So that's actually a good point, and it happens to help you simplify your keeping track of NPCs task. This is a happy coincidence, but
Well, and that one-dimensionality also is okay, not just because that's what ghosts are, but also because we've talked about this before. The power of the medium is that you can have these heavy-handed thematic or big ideas, these approaches that are a little tightly packed in or a little heavy-handed or a little one-note, and it's okay because in play, things spread out, right? It's my little spreading flower theory of adventure design. If you have a ghost that is very one-dimensional and is always looking for Tom, or always shying away in the corner, or always trying to wash the blood out of her garment or whatever, it's okay because there's so many other things going on. There's so many other things vying for the player's attention, they're doing the dungeon crawl, they're trying to puzzle things out, they're trying to piece things together, that when you get the one-dimensional character doing their one-dimensional thing, it's almost wow, I'm thankful for that. It's it's a thing. It's the one thing here I have to know.
I can hang on to this,
and again, and I'll tell you right now, players don't perceive it that way. They don't perceive it as one-dimensionality, and that goes back to what you said earlier in the episode, which is DMs kind of mess this up sometimes. They overcomplicate things.
Yeah.
You don't have to overcomplicate it, because in the RPG medium, in the context of a role-playing game, you want these simpler ideas. You want these big, straightforward ideas, because in play they don't come across as shallow.
Nice. All right. So the second thing to steal from Wraith of the Oblivion then is fetters. So fetters, as the name implies, are things that connect your dead character to the land of the living.
Mm-hmm.
So they're physical objects, or they can be living people, or they could be locations sometimes, but typically buildings. So it can't be an empty patch of ground. It has to be a specific location. If I recall correctly, I have not bought the PDF and checked this. So from my recollection, you were supposed to choose about 3 of these. I think that's a good number. So for each ghost, for each major character ghost you're inventing, 2 or 3 items from their life. So for example, their journal, or the sword of a knight, or just something a memento that's important to them. Have that. And have that lying around where it could be found. This is the point of contact between the ghost and your PCs. This is a thing they can find, a thing they can touch, and suddenly the ghost appears and says, "Don't touch that."
Right, yeah.
It's that kind of thing. And also a concept that I think is worth importing from Wraith, I think it's quite interesting, is one of the things your enemies might do to you on purpose in Wraith, or well-meaning people might do, was to destroy your fetters. You could start to lose your coherence and dissipate into nothingness if you lost that. Again, this obsessive hold was damaging you because you weren't moving on, but also your personality was latched onto it. There's a sort of bittersweet ending you can have for ghosts as well, that they can come to a sticky end perhaps in your story as well, or you might want them to. You might deliberately burn down the old barn because you want to get rid of this ghost.
Right.
Having physical items is very important, because much like the limed over skeleton of Regine in Mistmoor, the idea that they're obsessed with something that is going to corrode and disappear with time, this absolutely futile wanting to hang on to something from the material world, is a very powerful theme with ghosts as well. Yeah, I think maybe 3 for every ghost is too many if you have more than one in your story. Maybe 2, and then scribble that down on your notepaper. Yeah,
this is actually a pretty good segue into what I want to talk about when it comes to the ghost encounter, the actual just encounter of the ghost in your probably fantasy adventure game. Yep. And I fear, listeners, this is where I'm going to slot into story game snobbery, and I apologize, but I think that ghosts are a great example of where traditional role-playing games fall flat on their fucking face, because the ghost is a potentially really interesting and fascinating monster encounter that can go into so many cool places and do so many cool things. But in D&D, frequently, it is just reduced to its mechanical implications.
Yeah.
We get an encounter where it does the thing it does to harm you. It's usually a cheap thing, like lowering your levels. In the case of a Wraith, I think per se ghosts age you fast or something like that. You're reduced to sort of just its dangers, and then how to kill it, which is, okay, you better have a silver weapon or a magic weapon.
Yeah, I think Leonard Wilson agrees with you, because his whole approach here is just okay, the ghosts disappear whenever they want. They're not going to age you when they touch you. Forget all about it. We're going to go do a ghost story. Is being aged scarier than being stabbed? Not really.
Well, so, let's talk about it, because, here's the thing. the implication of being rapidly aged, or in the case of like a Wraith or a Spectre, like losing your levels, I think these are very cheap attacks personally on the mechanics. But the implications are so much more interesting than D&D usually gives you space to do.
Yeah.
What's really interesting about like rapidly aging is, well, first of all, I'm going to venture and guess that most role-playing game groups don't even account for that much. Like if you age 10 years, they're going to be whatever. Like if you're 35 and now you're 45, like that's not going to affect anything. But I think there's a way of making that a really profound moment at the table. And the way you do it is by asking questions. You know, how does it feel when the ghost passes through you and causes you to advance in age? What can you no longer do because you are 20 years older physically than you were? What sorts of things are you going to miss out on because you're going to die earlier than you planned? Just something to sort of allude to the idea that you have been aged, decades. The losing the levels thing is maybe a little, it's very D&D specific, and I've never liked that as a power that monsters do, and I'm pretty sure in 5e that's not the way it works anymore, which good. But again, taking the time to like explore this idea of like what the ghost attacks mean, I just think it'll pay off narratively, right? I just think there's a narrative focus you can do there to make that a much more interesting encounter. As far as like fighting the ghost goes, this is another place where this is typically a very boring thing. You have a magic weapon. Okay, that's how you kill the ghost. Boring.
Yeah.
The better thing to do is, like Ghost of Mistmoor again, is to find a way of settling the ghost, of quieting the ghost, right? Of letting the ghost pass on to the next world. That's a much more interesting encounter. That's a much more interesting adventure. In my game, The Between, one of the very first things you have to do is this haunting. This family's being haunted in their townhouse, and the whole scenario is about figuring out what happened to that ghost, that trauma, that history, and how do you use that to form a ritual to cause it to move on. That is just way more interesting than I have a magic pistol that lets me shoot the ghost dead.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that magic weapon could be interesting, much like the crucifix brandished at Dracula. It could keep the ghost away because it knows it will harm it. But then you've got a cool protective device against this angry ghost. But you still need to be addressing the story to banish it. That's the fun of ghost busting stories, right?
Yeah.
Isn't it?
So practical advice speaking, think about that. Right?
Yeah,
like if
just,
you're going to have
just
a
do
ghost,
that.
just do that. Yeah. I'm wondering if even if it's just a throwaway ghost encounter in the middle of like lots of other monsters and dangers, if there's a way you can even like incorporate some of that. I think maybe like questions that help draw out the horror of what happened to you if you got magically aged is a good one. I don't know if you necessarily want to bother with like a ritual to quiet the ghost that's just one ghost of 10 or whatever. Like that may not be interesting. Unless there's like a bigger way of quieting all the ghosts or something.
Well, that's the thing. I think if you have large numbers of ghosts, there needs to be some event that unifies that. They're the ghosts of dead soldiers who were massacred at some battle, and there should be some way to properly bury them or whatever.
Yeah.
And then within a dungeon, you're right, if you want a throwaway ghost, that could be haunting one particular section, so if you don't go in it doesn't matter. Plant just some simple thing you can do, like taking the ring off the skeleton back to its betrothed, and then something smallish like that. Make it a talking ghost so you can find this out perhaps, or
destroy the Fetters somewhere. Right?
Yeah, destroy the Fetters. Yeah, something like that would be would go a long way, and probably doesn't need too much additional prep on top of drawing out your
I don't think so.
dungeon map.
I don't think so. Yeah, it's just a way of like enriching the thing, because what you're going to do is you're going to write a dungeon or prepare a dungeon or adventure that is going to get a great reaction, like we're reacting to Ghost of Mistmoor, right? Essentially, right?
Yeah, apparently
you're going to get that kind of reaction. So worth doing.
Right.
I don't think I have anything else to say about this. Our point here is pretty clear. Ghosts are fascinating monsters. I don't think they should be reduced to just like basic mechanics. And furthermore, what makes the ghost story interesting is the implied horror, the backstory.
Yeah.
Anything else you want to add?
No, that's it. I had basically 2 thoughts and I said them. So, yeah.
Fabulous. Let's go on to the companion adventures. It's the companion adventures. I just have movies today.
Okay.
What do you got?
Oh, I've got a bit of music. Let me do that first. So this is sort of my recommendation, for a bit of maybe soundtrack or mood music for yourself on Mistmoor is the movie soundtrack from The Private Life of Sherlock Holmes. Not a great film, but it has a very nice, lush orchestral score that has this sort of mixture of a bit melancholy, a bit whimsical in places, and then kind of Hollywood adventure thrills, which I think is good for your D&D plus Ghosts mix. And then totally different, we haven't had any electronica for a while, so Sonic Area has an album called Key, that's K-I, and it's pretty good, like minimalist soundscapes, a bit creepy. The same artist also has an album called Music for Ghosts, but unfortunately it's a bit too frenetic for Mistmoor. Maybe for the showdown in the vault at the end you'd want it, but I think Key is the more ghostly, so I would go for that one. You want to talk films?
Yeah, let's talk films. I have 3 films. The early 60s are some of the best years for ghost movies. Some of the most noteworthy ghost movies come out within a couple of years of each other. So we have The Innocents, which is The Turn of the Screw, but it's called The Innocents. That's 1961. I believe that's the one with... Is that the one with Deborah Carr, or is that The Haunting? I'm pretty sure Deborah Carr is in that one. In any case, it's The Turn of the Screw. It's really, really good. Very atmospheric. Beautifully shot. Just a great movie. Then you have Carnival of Souls in 1962. Not so much a ghost story, but it does have some elements of it. And then, of course, we have The Haunting, a classic from 1963. Just some really, really good years for classic ghost stories in film.
Yeah, nice. Let me think. So, also in the black and white era, I'm going to recommend The Ghost and Mrs. Muir, which is sort of proving, I would say, our theory that ghost stories can be effective but not necessarily scary, because it's essentially a rom-com about a widow who moves to a lonely old house near the sea, and then the ghost, if I'm remembering this correctly, so it's Gene Tierney and Rex Harrison as this ghostly sea captain, and they fall in love, and it's funny, romantic, sad, and then a bit happy at the end. I think there's a happy ending where, she dies of old age and then they're together. yeah, if you can identify the core ghost themes in there, you'll be well on your way to your award-winning ghost-based D&D adventure. My other one from 2001 is the Guillermo del Toro film The Devil's Backbone, which is a really good movie and is about an orphanage during the Spanish Civil War. If I'm remembering this correctly, it's been a while since I saw it. About 20 years, I think, since I saw it.
Right. Yeah. Unless we're mixing it up with Pan's Labyrinth, I can't recall.
Yeah, no, I think that's a separate Spanish Civil War sad film with fantasy elements.
Right,
yeah. It's properly sad and kind of spooky, but it's not really a horror film. Like we mentioned with Mistmoor, it's chilling, I suppose, is the word, rather than horrifying. And good film. Well worth seeing.
Turns out 2001 is another great year for ghost stories, because my other movie is also from 2001, and that is The Others with Nicole Kidman. It is a updated take on the very classic sort of Victoriana ghost story movie, or ghost story tale, I guess. And it's got really, really strong Turn of the Screw vibes, but it's not about a governess. I think she's the mother of the kids.
She's the mother. It has a twist that you will see coming a mile off, probably. But I think if you were avoiding watching it because you think you know the twist, I don't think that matters. It's not really what it's about.
It's all about the atmosphere. It's about about the vibe. I'm also going to recommend, not a film, but I'm just going to recommend my YouTube playthrough of The Ghost of Mistmoor. It's available on my YouTube channel, and it's pretty good. So. Especially if you want to see how Trophy Gold works. Yeah. And listeners, that's our show. Fear of a Black Dragon is a production of The Gauntlet. You can find The Gauntlet on Twitter at GauntletRPG. We have a website that is gauntlet-rpg.com. If you'd like to support the show financially, you can do so at patreon.com/gauntlet. Tom, thank you so much.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you to our ectoplasmic editor, Rich Rogers. And thank you, listeners, for listening. Goodbye.
Take care.
Listeners, we want to let you know that Hearts of Wulin, our PBTA game of wuxia melodrama, is now available as a PDF on DriveThruRPG. Hearts of Wulin emulates films like Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon and Shadow, and TV series like The Untamed and Ancient Detective. It is inspired by the Chinese martial arts novels of Jin Yong and Gu Long and their many adaptations. In these tales, romance is as dangerous as a blade. You can buy Hearts of Wulin at the Gauntlet store on DriveThruRPG. You can find more information and resources for it on our Gauntlet blog, on the Gauntlet webpage at gauntlet-rpg.com.